Hey guys, welcome back to the Play on Footy channel. My name's Bailey. We're going to be recapping round one and what happened with the teams and a couple of fantasy scores as well. First game was the Carlton Blues versus the Richmond Tigers. This one was on the Thursday, 14th of March. It was at the MCG, so pretty packed crowd. 5 points in it, not much in it convincingly, really. I mean, the Richmond Tigers did really, really well considering the previous week against the Suns. And the Blues, they really held strong. I mean, they sort of dominated the first half, really, and then sort of fell away towards the end and just really hung on. Richmond's pressure was immense. And the stand-up players for Richmond were Nick Vlaston and Noah Bolter, both getting 108 in the AFL Fantasy. So that's a tremendous score. I think Noah Bolter's really proving that he can be the ultimate swingman. He sort of reminds me of the 05-06 Adam Hunter. So go back, go forward, and obviously kicked 3 goals, Noah Bolter, in that game. So pretty amazing. And then for the Rucks, Toby Nankervis got 103, and young Tom DeConing from Blues got 107. AFL Fantasy, that's pretty amazing. But overall, I think the big takeaway, unfortunately, was the news of Gipkiss injuring his ACL, his knees. So you've got him in your fantasy. That's probably a big blow. But it's just one of those things where, with these games, I mean, now that they play with such ferocity, injuries do occur more often. There was even news today that Oscar Allen's hurt his knee. So there's just, players every week, whether it be concussion or knees or Achilles. It's just, it's pretty sad. So, but great game, I think, by the Tigers. I thought real shame they didn't win that one. I actually think they were the better team that night, but the Blues just managed to hang on there. So they've off to a 0-2 start, the Blues. So watch out. They might be baggers of flaggers. The next game was the Collingwood Magpies versus the Sydney Swans at the MCG Friday night. So this was a really interesting game. I think because you're expecting a team that that were the grand finals and have won the premiership to be in fighting form, and sadly at this point the Magpies just aren't it at the moment. Whether it be down to wrong, personnel. Ash Johnson had a terrible game. There's a lot of, obviously a lot of profanity on social media after the game towards him, which, that's just not on. I agree he didn't have a good game, but there's no point, bagging out a player and becoming a whipping boy. It's a collective effort. And when you've got vision of players, high-fiving on the rebound as they're trying to actively defend, just shows to me that they've lost the hunger to defend and to win games. Clearly, Sydney Swans came out fighting form, as they generally do at the start of every season. But in particular now, they're sitting really well, really pretty at 2 wins to zip, which is amazing. And to win by 33 when really they were up by much more. Collingwood were able to kick a couple of late ones to minimise the gap. But it just goes to show that they're a force to be reckoned with this season for sure. Luckily for myself, I have Isaac Heaney in my AFL Fantasy. He was at 123 in this game. Another stellar game for Isaac Heaney, kicking 1 goal, 5 behinds. Imagine if he converted those goals, those behinds to goals. It would be just a totally different story there. His tackles were 5, handballs 11, kicks 16, and disposals 27.5. But he just every possession he had, he impacted as well. Nick Dacos 117 from the Pies, and Darcy Cameron from the ruck did really well, 108 AFL Fantasy as well. So that was pretty good. Braden Maynard's another notable mention, 102 AFL Fantasy there, and Chad Warner 100 AFL Fantasy, kicked 2 goals. Chad Warner. It's interesting to see with the Sydney Swans, do they move Heaney forward or do they keep him in the middle? Especially with Luke Parker out and a couple other Swans, do they keep the same format or will they be sort of trialling players out? I think they'll definitely be trialling a couple of players to see where they fit and see, if they can keep this momentum going, because they've got a real good synergy about them, as Adam Simpson would say, about the team. So I think, moving forward, if they can keep this energy up, and obviously Errol Golden's another great example, quite young, and he got 90.5 AFL Fantasy and only 18.5 he got 25 disposals, only 25 disposals, but in a team of Sydney Swans, they're all trying to share it together. So they all have amazing run off half back, and you could really see that in the game. They were just ripping Collingwood apart. I mean, making them look like witches' cones, and definitely have their game plan down. It's Collingwood in that game, you could definitely see. So, yeah, Collingwood are really the hunted this season, and I think hopefully they can, bring some energy the next round. But yeah, they just got eaten alive in this game. The next one was Essendon Bombers versus the Hawks at the MCG. This one here really surprised me. I actually backed Hawks in my tipping. So they unfortunately kicked themselves out of the game. They kicked 11 goals to 17 behinds, and Essendon were just pretty sharp shooters, 17 goals to 5 in this game. So they won by 24 points. The real standouts for me from Essendon were Jakey Stringer. I mean, he's come in this season in fine form. He's really been able to put pressure on the scoreboard, and especially when it counts as well at times. And another one is Archie Perkins. He got 130 in AFL Fantasy, and if you don't have Archie Perkins in your team, he's going to be a gun. I mean, he's come into this season just absolutely, he's just dominating, fit as a fiddle, and able to pressure opponents in the middle and to get it forward onto his right and left boot into the forward line. So yeah, that's a really scary prospect to other opposing teams. Dylan Moore was the standout, as well as Massimo D'Ambrosi for the Hawks. So they got in the 90s, both of those guys. So, but the other noticeable mentions for Essendon was Zach Merritt and Andrew McGrath. So they were Zach Merritt was 125 AFL Fantasy, and Andrew McGrath was 109. So yeah, the way that they're shaping and moving the ball, Essendon is miles in front of where they were, end of a couple of games of the last year. And I think, Brad Scott's really brought that sort of energy and air that he, once did have at North. I mean, at North, they managed to make finals, so hopefully they can end their 7,000-day losing final streak this year. But I'm not, it's hard to gauge because it's round one. So yeah, to see where they go to next. They've still got a couple of questions with a couple of players. In particular, it's Nick Cox. It's like, where do they put a 200-centimetre lanky, mobile running defender or attacker? Like, where do you put someone like him? Obviously, he's a great asset. But where do they sort of place him? That'll be the next question. For Hawks, I had John Newcomb in my AFL Fantasy. He got 62. But yeah, look, it was pretty evident he was tagged quite heavily. That incident with him and Mason Redmond, I mean, Mason Redmond got under his skin. So yeah, it's unfortunate. Next game is the GWS Giants and North Melbourne. This one here was actually not as bad as it seemed. I mean, they won by 39, the Giants, but there were points, especially in the first half, where North were really sort of close and quite good at putting pressure on the mids of the Giants. And in particular, the biggest standout players for me personally, Tom Green, obviously 145 AFL Fantasy, cannot go wrong with that. But if you had Tristan Sherry as the ruck from North Melbourne, you're laughing, 121 and kicked a goal. So those two players there, along with Jesse Hogan from GWS, kicking 6 and 2 behind. So he could have kicked 8 in this game easily. And then, of course, the main suspect, Harry Sheasel, best and fairest last year for North Melbourne, he got 120, AFL Fantasy. Didn't kick any goals or behind, but he was really working hard behind the board to try and bring it forward as well. In my AFL Fantasy, I had Lockie Whitfield. He got about 100, so down the back, that's not a bad effort as well. Next game is the Geelong Cats versus the Saints. This one was a nail-biter. Obviously, Max King up forward did pretty well considering he was had a lot of pressure on him all night. But yeah, the Cats just got up by 8 points at GMHBA. Their massive launch of the new stadium, which looked pretty cool. Rowan Marshall in the ruck, 118 AFL Fantasy, as well as Jack Steele with 108 Fantasy, and Patrick Dangerfield with 105 and a clutch goal. So yeah, look, the real standouts for me, which was actually one of their new players for Geelong, was Oliver Dempsey. He got 92 AFL Fantasy and 3 goals and 1 behind. So yeah, he was, as you could understand, an understandable key component to their win. And I think, Saints didn't really know what to do. Ross and I didn't know what to do because, it's his first game. They don't have any sort of prior knowledge as to what he can do and how well he can do things. So that to me was the standout there. And for the Saints, I'd go Wanganeen Miller. I think he did really well as well as like a new player coming into the Saints there and getting 84 in AFL Fantasy, which is pretty commendable. But yeah, I unfortunately got this tip wrong. I tipped Saints, but I think Saints, don't write them off. versing Geelong in their home ground, especially when they're releasing a new stadium, is no easy feat. And so for them to only be missing out by 8 points is still a very commendable effort. This next game, Suns versus Adelaide Crows at the Gold Coast, and yeah, six points in it. I mean, Gold Coast were up at 3/4 time by, I think it was like 6 goals, and then it only just sort of scrape in a win is it's pretty amazing. When Adelaide were really coming hard and fast. Commendable players for Suns were Noah Anderson, 126 AFL Fantasy, Rory Laird for Adelaide, 119, Sam Flanders, 119 as well from Suns, and Matty Rowell, 115 AFL Fantasy. I have Matty Rowell on my team, so I'm pretty happy with that. But yeah, if you definitely want to get another quality player in your midfield, I'd definitely recommend Flanders or Anderson. There's a lot of upside with those players. Took Miller is demanding a lot, but at least he's getting 100 each game, which can't be said with someone like Jai Newcomb. The only other downside from this game, which I did realise, which was Ben King. He got 7 AFL Fantasy, which is just like, he didn't kick any goals behinds, and I think he had like 4 disposals. So yeah, if you had him like I did in my AFL Fantasy, you'd be spewing. But again, it was raining pretty heavily, and it was only certain players that really stood up to the challenge with that wet weather footy, and they were the main players I just rallied off just then. So yeah, a lot of upside with the Suns, 2-0 start, which is really good. So you'll see if they can carry on with the next round. Next one is the Melbourne Demons versus the Bullies, and yeah, they got up the Demons by 45 points, which to me is no real surprise. I just don't see the Bulldogs doing very well this season. They've got such good depth and good players in their list. They just do not know how to execute or gel together. And it's just something that you've been seeing recurring, especially from last season, especially with Bailey Smith out with the ACL. And you sort of brought in someone like Harms, who used to play for Melbourne. Are they the sort of players you want to be recruiting? You want, I understand depth and mature age, players sometimes to fill gaps like that, but I've always seen Bulldogs as quite a young side, which they are, and for them to be making some recruiting like that just doesn't make sense. Jack Billings was a great recruit for Melbourne. Talking about great recruits, he got 114 AFL Fantasy, so he's originally from Saints. Max Gawn, 137 AFL Fantasy, Christian Petrarch, 121, Stephen May, 119, Clayton Oliver, 114, and Tim English, 113. Yeah, look, I don't really see Beveridge surviving this season, to be honest. There's nothing against the guy. I think he's a great coach, and he obviously won their first flag in so long, back in 2016. I just don't know how much patience the board has, especially Chris Grant, and apparently Chris Grant and him do not get along, so I just don't see if, you're trying to build something, it takes everyone, it takes the board, the football club, and, players all to be on the same page, and unfortunately, if there's friction, I just don't see his job safe for much longer, especially with drubbings like 45 points against Melbourne. Port versus the Eagles. I mean, this was the biggest total out of the whole sort of round, 50-point loss to the Eagles, which, again, for a lot of Eagles fans like myself, we probably say that isn't a bad sort of result, considering we were a lot closer through most of the parts of the game. Just in the last 10 minutes of the fourth quarter, we sort of let some goals and points slide. I mean, Port kicked 24 behinds. Yes, the result could have been a lot worse if they had kicked straight, but the fact of the matter is they didn't. So that's why we lost only by 50 points. The other big news from this game was obviously Harley Reid's debut, which he did very well, considering a lot of heat from WA for him to do well. A lot of pressure being, number one pick. But I honestly think he held his cool. He actually brought a bit of brutality, a bit of physicalness to the game, which Eagles have been famously not being able to bring consistently, especially the last couple of years. So to have a young kid out there, 18, and actually bring it up to someone like Charlie Dixon or Todd Marshall was just great to see. I hope he does it or continues to do it in the next couple of rounds as well. And the other big news from this game, I'm recording this on a Wednesday, but yeah, Oscar Allen has hurt his knee. He'll be out for about 7 to 8 weeks apparently at this stage, a bit of bruising around his knee. Not what we wanted as a club. He's the co-captain, Duggan's the other co-captain, and we just don't need this sort of disruption to the season. I know he doesn't definitely want this disruption to the season, so I really feel for him. allows us opportunity to bring in someone like Ryan Marrick, who didn't play in this game. For whatever reason, he didn't play. But we definitely need someone like that. And then obviously when, Jai Cully gets back from his ACL, putting someone like him up forward, he's 194 centimetres. He's not a short midfielder. So if we can get someone like that up forward, that would alleviate us a lot. But again, it just comes at really poor timing. We're supposed to have Flynn in the ruck and Bailey Williams as centre half forward, which would have, definitely given us a couple more options, leading options. And now we're really having to rely on Jack Darling, who's really, had a shocking game against Port. But again, our inside entries to inside for the forward 50 were just shocking. So Port Adelaide really need to understand for themselves that they've got a lot to improve on, but we also have a lot to improve on as well as a club going forward, especially the Eagles. I mean, they need to play the youth. Adam Simpson needs to play the youth, and that should be the theme of this year, to actually get a kickstart of the rebuild, really. Last but not least, the Dockers versus Brisbane Lions game. That was a really, really great start by the Lions in the first quarter. And in the third quarter, Freo really, kick-started basically their domination of the Brisbane Lions, and it led to a 23-point win. I mean, Lions did try and come back a little bit towards the end of the fourth quarter, but it just didn't click with them. They did have a couple of injuries with Darcy Garden in the back line coming off as well. So, going forward, I think the Lions really need to improve on that if they're going to win games. But one man really stood up, and that was Caleb Sarong from Fremantle Dockers. I mean, he got 46 disposals, and I think he killed the AFL Fantasy. If we have a quick look here, what did he get? He got 161. AFL Fantasy. Josh Dunkley got 126, and Luke Ryan got 125. I mean, that's just unbelievable from those guys. Andrew Brayshaw, I should say, he got 118 AFL Fantasy. So, yeah, not bad considering everything. But yeah, the Freo boys, if they can continue this throughout the year, who knows? Again, Brisbane, just like Magpies, aren't bringing the heat. They were the grand finalists last year. And they're just sleeping at the wheel. But they do have a bye this week, so hopefully they can rejuvenate and restock and go again. What do you reckon, guys? What was your round one take of this season so far? Please leave a comment and like, and I'll see you in the next one.